Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our sixth webinar of 2021. And we're going a little bit off piece today from the standard sports nutrition topics that we've been doing. And I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Patricia Worby, who I personally interwork with clients, and I've seen her work in her clinical context. I think the behavioral aspects of working with clients is an absolutely fundamental aspect with nutrition. So mostly we're coming from a nutritional or an exercise perspective. We're working on behaviors. That's something Patricia and I did on Monday there with a group of people. Today, it's more of a mind-body aspect. So it's emotions and how they impact the mitochondria, which is something I saw from Patricia about a year ago when she was presenting. And I thought, okay, we need more of that. So I've invited her to come and talk specifically about mitochondria, but within her remit of working with people's emotional health. Yeah, feel free to throw through some good questions, maybe client-centered questions. Okay, I'm going to pass over to you, Patricia. Maybe you want to say one or two things about yourself and then kick it off.
Okay, hope everyone can hear me. My name's Patricia Worby, and I'm a trauma therapist. I use somatic trauma therapy, but by training, I'm a biochemist, physiologist, pharmacologist. I studied nutritional medicine, and then I actually recovered from chronic fatigue syndrome myself by using more holistic methods, such as massage, energy work, including tapping. And I sort of changed my worldview from the purely scientific to this more integrated approach, which is what I now do. So I use science as the backdrop, but I use the broader spectrum of a holistic vision of the human being to help actually promote healing. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is how the mind and body interface and how that relates on a cellular level in emotions, which are totally ignored in general medicine at the moment. So we're going to cover a little bit about emotional regulation as well. So without further ado, I shall begin. And so that's the title, a new paradigm of burnout and chronic illness. So I want you to understand that these principles apply to practically every condition in some measure, obviously more so in some illnesses than in others. And so I'm going to look at the mind and body connection, in particular the autonomic nervous system. I'm then going to dive into mitochondrial structure and function. Now, I understand most of you will already know quite a lot about mitochondria, but I hope I'm going to give you some new information that perhaps you won't know. And then I'm going to tie that in with toxic stress. I'm going to define what toxic stress is, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happens in childhood, adverse childhood experience, or ACE. Then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the cell danger response and hormetic overwhelm. In particular, we're going to look at how that relates in a case study, a sports case study. And then finally, if we get time, I'm going to cover a very tiny bit of polyvagal theory. I haven't got time to go into that in detail, but it is so important for you to understand when somebody is sitting opposite you, how their vagal tone and how their autonomic nervous system is organizing. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about recovery, how you might promote that in your clients. Okay, so the first slide then is looking really at the field of psychoneuroimmunology. And this is really the basis for mind-body medicine. It's the link, obviously, between psychology, neurology, and immunology. And it's an absolutely essential component of a systems approach to medicine. All systems communicate via the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and also the autonomics themselves, which are divided into two, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. So this diagram just kind of it's an overview diagram of how the whole thing links, just so that you understand that it's a systems approach, and that when a stressor comes in, it deranges that system. The other important thing for you all to know is that emotions are not mental concepts. They are felt physiologically in the body as well as in the mind. And so when we talk about emotions, we can't divorce the physiology as well. And emotions are related very much to stressful events. We feel emotions, we tend to feel them more strongly when we're undergoing some form of stress, whether it's a positive stressor or a negative stressor. But the ones that really stick are those from overwhelming life events. That's another definition of trauma, if you like, which broadens the definition of trauma hugely. And these overwhelming events are stored in the body and then triggered in the present life by other overwhelming events, which the body perceives as a threat. And thus we end up with a cumulative burden of unprocessed emotions. And I can absolutely say that was the situation for me, and it's what caused me to trigger over into chronic fatigue syndrome. And just a quick aside, it was the death of my father when I was 19 that I'd never fully processed, and it wasn't until I got ill. My relationship broke down, and then I had to move, and I lost my home, and that was the thing that knocked me into chronic fatigue, because I hadn't processed the loss of 20 years previously. Now, all emotions are not the same in terms of their effect physiologically, and there are some that are more deeply embedded than others. And the triad that I consider the most important are abandonment, betrayal, and humiliation. And every child has some form of this. If you've gone through a normal childhood, it's not unusual to feel those kinds of emotions. It's how they're supported that makes the difference. If you're supported in those emotions, you can process them. But if you lack support, or the right support at the right time, they become stuck. And these three are the most important landscapers of the brain. They actually change you neuroplastically to derange your physiology. And it does that throughout the lifespan. So it isn't just a one-off, it deranges the physiology and then the physiology bounces back. It often deranges it as it's a cumulative burden in an increasing manner. And so you often see clients coming who are, they started with childhood illnesses, things like asthma, eczema, gut issues, but as they've got older, the issues go deeper and they go much more intense. And so it's changing your autonomics that is the key factor in all of this. The autonomic nervous system is the linking factor in every symptom you will see. And emotional stress and trauma, therefore, have these shame imprints, these emotional shame imprints that linger on in the adult. And it's completely ignored in allopathic medicine outside psychiatry. And even in psychiatry, they're more likely to diagnose you with a syndrome and want to medicate that. And so we're looking at it holistically, which is a very different model. So I just want to dial down a little bit into the limbic system. Limbic system is your internal brain. It's sometimes also called the emotional brain. It lies in the middle between the two lobes of your cortex. And actually it has a left and a right as well, that's why I've chosen this diagram, not the common one that you'll see, which is the slice through, just so that you know that you have a left and a right side to your limbic brain. And it's a fairly ancient brain compared to your cortex. In evolutionary terms, it's a mammalian brain, and it's linked to survival as well as physiological function. So its main purpose is to keep you alive. And it has recourse to a number of different strategies for that, which unfortunately are not well adapted to modern life, to the kinds of stresses that we now undergo. It's more adapted to meeting a saber-toothed tiger in a clearing, and you're either going to run and survive or you're going to die, and you need to shut down in order to prepare for that. And that's kind of where your limbic system is. And so it's a very ancient system that is adapted by its experience. So the brain learns from its experience, from particularly early experiences. And I've talked about adverse childhood experiences, but the ones between 0, I should actually say -9 months from conception through to about the age of 7 are the most important landscapers of the brain, and they change the structure and function of your limbic brain in particular to cause certain parts to grow and certain parts to shrink. And if you look at the two parts that grow, your stress response area, your hypothalamus, that becomes larger, and your amygdala, which is your smoke alarm, which is sometimes also called the fear center, but it should also be understood as the familiarity center, they get larger. And the parts that shrink are the ones that actually allow proper sifting, sensory processing, relaying, and memory encoding. And this is really important because memory can be laid down without a context stamp or a time stamp in the hippocampus when you're under this kind of stress. The other bit that gets shut down is your prefrontal cortex, the bit that now allows you to analyze and think and process and plan things. And so the prefrontal cortex's normal job is to actually inhibit fear. And so if your PFC is small and not very functional, you're going to have a much lower threshold to reach a fear response, which is what in fact happened to me. And I never knew I had a low threshold, because how do you know what's normal other than what you've always felt? And so just looking briefly at the autonomic nervous system, it's commonly perceived as a two-way system, this parasympathetic, sympathetic balance. That is a slightly naive view. We're realizing there's a lot more complexity to it now. But just to understand that the autonomics is kind of the translation of your limbic brain into the body, which automatically or unconsciously controls your physiological functioning and also your survival. Now, you've got the parasympathetic, which is that lovely rest and digest system, but it's also responsible for something called the freeze response, which I'm going to come on to in a minute. And the sympathetic is very commonly known as the fight and flight system, but again, it also has a fawn system as well, and that's more common in children, and it's more common in women as compared to men. So that if fight and flight are not available, you have these other systems to rely on. And as you can see in the diagram, they innervate your viscera, so all the internal organs in reciprocal fashion. So generally, if the sympathetics raise something, the parasympathetic will lower it. It's very much this sort of seesaw or balancing. Under stress, however, particularly if it's a constant or unresolvable stress, the amygdala just carries on firing. It can't stop. It doesn't get switched off, and it activates the stress response continually rather than being switched off. And so we call this system sympathetic dominance, and you'll see a lot of clients in sympathetic dominance. There are specific telltale signs, which I'll show you in a minute. But overall, it changes gut function, immunity, brain neurochemistry, and it provides these cellular messages of threat. So if it doesn't switch off, then your cells are actually receiving this message as much as the rest of you. And because it's considered normal, you don't realize that you're under this continual stress. So people don't know that they're under this form of toxic stress. And in terms of what the symptoms you'll find, particularly in sports, you'll come across all sorts of interesting symptoms of fatigue, which is unrelated to how much sleep they've got. You know, fatigue is not the same as being tired. It's actually something that will drain you even if you've had moderate exercise, because there's something going wrong with your energy delivery system. Some people get that after exercise, and that's often referred to as exercise intolerance. I'm not going to go through all the symptoms, there's quite a lot here, but some that are very common, low blood pressure, particularly when standing from sitting down or lying down. And it's all to do with this autonomic dysregulation. Things can't adjust in quickly enough to facilitate that transition. And so we get these combination symptoms. Not everybody will have all of these symptoms. You'll see different combinations in different people. But brain fog or concentration and memory problems are also very common. For me, insomnia was my first symptom. It was the one that really precipitated my downfall, and I just stopped being able to sleep well, and eventually was not sleeping at all, which, as I can warrant, is a horrible place to be. And so remember, this sympathetic dominance is where the system is unable to be switched off. And the brain and the body are therefore bathed in cortisol and adrenaline. Particularly adrenaline is very important in women because we've got less testosterone. And what it does, obviously it damages a lot of the body, but in particular it damages the memory center of your brain, the hippocampus, which is the most neuroplastic region of your brain, which changes more than any other part of your brain according to your environment. And so you get distorted memories that are laid down in a way that does not change, it does not update, it stays as a sense of threat when you're in this situation. And any small stress that comes along in your daily life, therefore, adds to this cumulative burden to an already overloaded system. And so the straw that breaks the camel's back may be a tiny one. You know, for some people, it's literally reaching for the toothpaste and their back caves in. For me, as I say, it was a relationship that broke down, but it brought a terrific amount of fatigue, and I was actually bedbound for about 3 or 4 months where I couldn't walk. And many amateur athletes are unaware, in fact, how much stress they're under because they're juggling so many different things. So they'll be doing their training, but they're also juggling jobs because they won't be professional, and the family stresses as well, and trying to fit all that in, and training in their spare time. So they'll be cutting down on their sleep and waking early in order to fit that in. And this is a very dangerous situation to be in because your autonomic nervous system can only take so much before it's going to crash. And so this pushing through, which we see, and I certainly see in a lot of my clients, I get a lot of A-type people who are pushing through and just trying to focus on getting the job done, whatever the job is, are the most likely ones to crash and to get that burnout. And as I've said, you end up with not enough sleep, and eating becomes also not relaxing. And as you probably are already aware, it's not just what you eat, it's how you eat that really impacts your digestive capacity. So if you're eating on the run or in the car, or you're not taking time to really chew, you're going to actually reduce your digestive capacity hugely. And so overall, we see this burnout syndrome where stress is becoming totally toxic to the body. And this is a different sort of stress than the average stress that you can normally bounce back from. It's damaging those parts of the body that use the most energy as well, because as I said, it's an energy dysfunction. And so skeletal muscle, your heart, which is where you get these blood pressure irregularities and sometimes heart palpitations, and your nervous system, which uses a huge amount of energy, including your brain. So hence the brain fog symptoms. Now, I want to go into more detail on the cellular origins of that energy deficit. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on mitochondrial energy production because I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. But something I do want to introduce is the evolutionary origins of mitochondria, which some of you might not know. I certainly didn't. That mitochondria, if you look at them under a microscope, they have a remarkable similarity to a bacterium. And there's a reason for that. They actually are formerly bacteria that fused with an animal cell. So it was actually an archaebacterium which fused with an ancient animal cell 1.45 billion years ago is the estimate. And they gave us aerobic respiration, because up to that point we didn't have that. And so this opportunity to create energy from oxygen via oxidative phosphorylation was granted to us by this fusion with mitochondria and the precursor to the animal cell. As you know, they exist in most cells except red blood cells. but especially those with high energy needs. So again, this is tying into what we just looked at a minute ago. The heart in particular, 25% of the heart cells are mitochondria. It's a huge number. But also nerves and mitochondria are transported along the axons to wherever they're needed, and hence a lot of neurological symptoms when energy is in deficit. And skin. And so skin is actually obviously also part of your immune system. So if that goes, you could be in trouble. And the gut, of course, is internalized skin. So gut issues are very prevalent as well. The other important thing about mitochondria is that they have their own DNA in circular plastids. So these are not like nuclear DNA, they're very different. And they're not mixed between mother and father either. They come entirely from the maternal line through the fission of your mother's mitochondria in the egg. So any problems that she's had in terms of her stress response are bequeathed to you via mitochondrial DNA. Now, we know that mitochondria themselves have a more efficient form of metabolism. We just talked about that. Oxidative phosphorylation is about 15 times more efficient than glycolysis. But the other thing is it's also an extension of your microbiome, because with their bacterial origins, they actually communicate with the bacteria in your gut and elsewhere to have this community interaction of different molecules that are passed between them, which signify the state of the organism. And so this extension of the microbiome that mitochondria constitute actually is what we believe now has enabled animals to evolve to more complex organisms such as ourselves. And so they're hugely important biologically beyond just their factory energy function. The dysfunction of mitochondria is so common that I would say, and the term for this is mitochondriopathy, I would say that it's at the heart of most chronic disease, if not all, and it's largely environmental or lifestyle. Some, as I've said, is brought from your maternal line, and certainly the propensity is brought from your maternal line, but it's the environment that switches it on or off. And so a stressful environment is obviously going to cause a lot of issues with mitochondrial function. And in particular, toxicity is one of the main issues. And this is the electron transport chain. I'm not an expert in the ETC, so I'm not going to pretend I know all about it. But I do know that it's a chain. And what gets in the way of it functioning really well is anything that blocks certain stages in that chain. So we've got, this isn't the inner membrane, the inner phospholipid membrane of mitochondria. And you'll see that there are embedded proteins and they kind of act as channels, and then protons and electrons, in fact, are moved around and provide the gas, if you like, for this functioning. It's a very fascinating area, and there are people who really specialize in this area. But importantly, you need specific nutrients for it to function well. And there are 22 specific ones that it needs: magnesium, zinc, CoQ10, D-ribose, omega-3, and so on and so on. And these, unfortunately, are not readily available in most processed foods, as we know. And we get the added burden of toxicity in the environment. And so we're seeing things like pesticides, glyphosate. I could do a whole lecture on glyphosate and how that blocks the ETC, because it masquerades as glycine. It actually attaches to the same receptors, so that can be a really big problem in a lot of people. Heavy metals is another problem from dental amalgams, all sorts of sources, actually coal burning in power stations. Obviously cars used to be a major problem for that. And volatile organic compounds in water processing. The tap water that you drink often contains volatile organic compounds, and they actually starve the mitochondria. And so we've got this acute stress response, which will come along normally from cold or exercise, Sometimes infrared light, just being exposed to sunlight, is a hormetic stress, and they are necessary and good to stimulate this hormesis, this hormetic function. But chronic or toxic stress is very different. This is the unremitting one that doesn't switch off. And this downregulates energy function without resolution. And if any one nutrient in the cycle is lacking, because it's a chain, the weakest link in the chain will break the chain. Toxins will block it, and chronic stress may interfere with it as well. The recycling will of these protons and electrons will actually stop, and it actually takes down oxidative phosphorylation quite quickly, and that is going to show in energy deficiency symptoms, which, as I've said, can be the major ones, but it can also be things like dizziness as well. That's another major problem, tinnitus, and there are very many different symptoms. So the important point, I think, is beyond their role as energy producers, mitochondria are also sensing organelles. They sense danger and threat in the environment and translate that via what's now called the cell danger response to deliberately slow down energy function. So you've got this toxicity and you've got this stress burden. And in order to protect DNA in the nucleus of the cell, you actually need to downregulate your energy production to prevent oxidation of your DNA. And so really, mitochondria are intelligent. They regulate energy production by monitoring the environment, and they respond to all different inputs, physical, chemical, energetic. I've missed that one out. They also respond to energy, infrared, and microbial conditions within and around the cell. So, as I've said, they communicate with each other and they communicate with your microbes. And so under stress on particularly low oxygen, or if you've got excess processed carbohydrates, which are nutrient deficient, low vitamins and minerals, this cell danger response is activated. And if you want to read more about the cell danger response and you want to understand it in detail, I would refer you to the work of Robert Navio, who has been writing for the last 12, 13 years on this subject. That's the most recent paper I could find that was relevant to this talk. But Robert he's really worked hard on this and come up with what I think is one of the defining theories. So what happens under stress then, under this cell danger response, is that cells will switch to anaerobic energy production, this glycolysis, which is 15 times less efficient and causing huge number of symptoms, which I've listed again. So there's very many, and some are called specific things like POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, post-viral fatigue. We're seeing a lot of long COVID at the moment, and I think that's just a classic, a perfect storm of stress, low nutrients, and the sort of virus coming in and being the final trigger. But it's mainly a dysfunction of high energy consuming organs. And thus, over time, we see it more and more in long-term conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, and even cancer. And there's a good theory, a metabolic theory of cancer, I think, which explains it far better than the current conventional model. And it's triggered both by these internal stressors, so things going on inside the body, which, by the way, includes your emotions and your thoughts, and the external stressors of what's happening in your life and the toxicity that you're encountering. And what happens to mitochondria when they get these influences is that they start to talk amongst each other. And actually, this affects the way they gather together, because mitochondria are often shown in diagrams as one mitochondrion in the cell. But that's not how they exist, because they exist in communities. And it's how they come together, the fission, and then the fusion is what controls the efficiency of the system. So mitochondria are like bacteria, they group together and communicate. And they have certain ATPs, a communication signal. It's not just an energy molecule. It's actually one that enables the surrounding mitochondria to know whether there's excess fission going on, because ATP will then leak outside and there'll be a rise in ATP. If this signal of damage, excess damage occurs, then the message of threat is basically passed from cell to cell, because there'll be a disturbance in this fission fusion balance. When you bring mitochondria together in fission, that is actually going to help mix contents, and that's usually regarded as a way of keeping cells entire and healthy. But on the other hand, you do need fission as well, because you need old and degraded mitochondria to be broken down and eaten, and digested by the phagophores. So it's this lovely, beautiful, intelligent systems view of what happens to mitochondria within the cell that enables the cell to retain its energy function. And if you've got too many degraded and destroyed mitochondria in your cell, that's when your energy function is going to be very, very poor. And so chronic stress is really a biological switch into anaerobic metabolism to conserve the cell DNA. And cancer is, interestingly, a loss of the control mechanisms that allow the switch on and off. And so you get a loss of this apoptotic control of rogue cells, and thus proliferation of damaged and overgrowing cells, which is effectively what cancer is. And so there's a new theory adapted from what's called the Warburg hypothesis, that it's a form of elective glycolysis. In other words, it's not just like a switch that comes on randomly. It's actually designed within the cell to preserve its survival at all costs. And it's all due to this loss of ATP signaling, or the loss of control of the signaling in and outside the cells. So the priority is reset to optimize survival of the organism, even if it's shut down, even if it's barely able to function, as long as it can, the organism can just have enough energy to breathe, it can survive. And that is a situation that a lot of people end up in when they have chronic fatigue syndrome, or sometimes post-viral fatigue, but it comes in lesser degrees in many, many different syndromes that you'll come across. So it's this freeze response, and the cell stops communicating properly, and this systems view, this control, this intelligence gets lost, and disease is inevitable. Now, this diagram, I don't expect anyone to follow it entirely, but this is Robert Navio's sort of cell danger response diagram, and it's a model for what happens whenever you get a chronic stress, which takes you away from the normal healthy development cycle. And I've just ringed that in green here, which is activity, good nutrient intake, restorative sleep, and that's meant to just continue normally. What disturbs that normal cycle is a toxic stress, and a toxic stress can be virtually anything. As I've said, it can be unresolved emotions, it can be a change in your environment from hot to cold, it can be anything that deranges your ability or your homeostatic ability to restore itself. And what's interesting about this model is that it's a cycle that needs to complete. And so you can't reverse the cycle, you can't go backwards, you can only go in one direction. And that's why you'll see there are different colors there, the red, the blue, and the yellow. And it's going around in that direction, and it has to be completed in order for the CDR to switch off. So the CDR is not only a stress response, it's involved in normal healthy growth, recycling, and aging. But if your restorative sleep goes wrong, and that's as I said, one of the first symptoms for a lot of people, then you can start to get this issue where the cycle is interrupted and you go down the other cycle. And it's a new theory of chronic illness, which I love because it helps explain what types of illnesses people get depending on where in the cycle they are blocked from completion. So It's a 3-stage cycle, which is meant to complete. And the first one is the containment, and that's your innate immunity, that inflammatory response, damage control, maybe isolating areas that are damaged. And then there's the repair phase, which is where you recruit stem cells and bring in cell replacement, and that needs the vast amount of ATP. And then there's the reconnection phase, in which tissues get remodeled and you get the adaptive immune response, detoxification, which uses more ATP, and interestingly, pain modulation and sleep tuning. And so where people get stuck in chronic pain, for instance, they're often stuck at this point. Healing cannot occur until all stages of the CDR complete, and the cycle gets stuck at any number of roadblocks. And I urge you to have a look at this diagram, and I will try and send this on actually, so people can have a look at it, because it's a really interesting understanding. If the roadblocks come in at specific points along that cycle, you get different responses and different diseases. But they're all basically coming from incomplete healing, which can then be made worse by further injury. So if you're 3/4 of the way round the cycle and then you get another injury, that can also derail you. It's anything really that is perceived by the body as a toxic insult to survival. And as I said, that's a very broad range of things. So toxins can be nutritional, pollution, societal. We're going through a tremendous amount of societal trauma at the moment, which, and again, that's another complete talk on its own. But also you've got this past burden as well. Don't forget, if you're training, for instance, if you're in polluted environments, that's going to definitely affect you. Now, I just want to make sure I'm okay for time. Yeah. Okay. Adverse childhood experiences are anything that overwhelms your capacity, your nervous system's capacity to cope, but very commonly they're regarded as abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. It's regarded as a threat to your mind and body, laid down as a form of memory called implicit memory in your limbic system and your body, and it does not change with time. So it doesn't get remade. Like a lot of memories get remade. Normal memories, you can get things conflated and mixed up, and traumatic memory never changes, and it's usually very sensory. It's very visual, or it's a feeling that you have. The original adverse childhood events study was done in 1998, and it was done in order to help understand why certain people within Kaiser Permanente, which is an American HMO, lost weight during a weight loss program that they were running, but then put it all back on again once the program stopped. And the investigators wanted to know why some people didn't recover, didn't stay with the weight loss, and other people did. And they asked a series of 10 questions, which had never been asked before. What happened to you in childhood? Because they had a little inkling, or Vincent Felitti did, that something that happened to people early in their lives might be influencing the way their bodies responded in adult life. And he identified these 10 major sources which profoundly alter your neurology and potentiate your stress response. Things like death of a loved one, addiction of a parent or a sibling, incarceration of a parent, that's an abandonment, divorce, that's another abandonment, sometimes also a betrayal, a loss of a child, absolute devastating experience, and chronic illness itself, of course, which is a form of betrayal of the body to you. And this is all put through the HPA axis and the autonomic nervous system. So I don't think I need to go in detail with this, but it was a very big study. The results were very, very shocking, that 28% of these middle-class, well-heeled, insured people had physical abuse, and 21% actually had sexual abuse. And it has a dose-response relationship. So as you know, with anything scientific, if it's a dose-response relationship, then it's strongly correlated. They had a 3 times risk of heart disease. I can't read that, how many. It was a huge risk of lung cancer increase as well. And if you had more than 6 ACEs in your childhood, you have a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And I'm just going to pause after that. A 20-year difference in life expectancy with 6 or more, right? It changes everything about you. And further studies have supported this finding. It's now obviously many years since that original study, but we've had some in the UK as well. And it's just been more and more and more correlated. 360% risk of heart disease in children whose parents divorce. You're far more likely to have strokes as an adult. It just goes on and on. It also changes your behavior, not just your disease risk. So things like overcompensation, overtraining, a need for high achievement. I see this, I had this myself, I still do to some extent, but I'm working on it. The need to achieve and to push yourself and to overcome what your body perceives as an ongoing emotional stress. And that's just the dose-response relationship. And so unresolved stress and toxic stress is not limited to big T, what we call big T events, where, we used to think you'd only have a trauma if you'd been in a war zone or you've been bombed or had a fire or something like that. But it can be little things like being bullied at school, the experience of racism, which is ongoing, a loss of your home, being adopted can be another one, having your mother have postnatal depression. There are so many different experiences that people endure, and they get recorded in the limbic system as implicit memory, and that translates to the body. And so I'm just going to go through that. The triggers can be anything that reminds the body of the originating event. So it can be similar emotions, sounds, smells, sights, anything really that evokes the same feeling in you. And these responses are unconscious. And the only way you know you're being triggered generally is because you get a symptom. Don't forget, these traumatic memories don't change. They never vary, they don't decay, and they stay with you. And it's the meaning of the event, not the event itself. So it doesn't have to be a massive thing, but if it was massive to you, like being told by your school teacher that you were rubbish and you'd never amount to anything, or your father saying that, they don't have to be violent acts. They can be just ones that have meaning for you. And it's anything really that feels unpredictable as well. Sometimes the parent is nice to you, sometimes they're not, or maybe you get bullied at school, but not always, and you never know which it's going to be. If you've got family secrets, I had lots of family secrets in my childhood, things that I was never told, but I just perceived something was off. It's the unpredictability which makes it so threatening, because the nervous system fails to adjust. And so this cellular threat, once triggered, is not resolved. And so that's the essence of the CDR, really. And I just want to finish up with a case study, which was a chap who I'm going to call Carl, who grew up with an alcoholic father, who eventually left the family. Well, they actually had to run and escape him. And they moved many times, and including a time when he had to spend 2 years in a children's home because his mother couldn't cope and couldn't take him on. And the terrible financial insecurity of constantly moving and never knowing if they were going to be okay. And he grew up wanting to avoid insecurity at all costs in his adult life. And he actually did very well. He did very well. He became an overachiever in business and sport, and burning the candle at both ends, and never realizing, in fact, that this is an adaptation to his childhood. He kind of knew he was the way he was because of that, but he didn't understand that it was beginning to limit him. He went into the armed forces. He came out of the armed forces, and then he became a CEO of his own high-earning business. He got married. They wanted to have children, and then his wife was unable to naturally conceive, and they went through 7 rounds of IVF. And that was the thing that tipped him into CFS and ME. But it wasn't the thing that created the CFS ME. It was the past experiences that he'd had in his body stored up as a sense of overwhelming threat, which this life experience of going through something so unpredictable as IVF tipped him into. And all his coping mechanisms, his overworking and trying to fix it, failed. They actually made the situations worse, because they tend to cycle you down into the CDR, as you've now understood. And so then despair and desperation follows, because everything that's worked before no longer works, and you feel absolutely bereft and overwhelmed. He'd had nutritional support. He'd had lots of nutritional support. And being a sportsman, he already knew loads about nutrition. And when he came to me, Andy, and he was dealing with that pretty well, but he did have this inability to understand his emotions. He was absolutely disconnected from his emotions. And getting him to really feel things in a deep way and experience what it felt like to be his younger self was really key to getting him through this, and getting the bigger picture and helping him to see what needed to happen in order for him to heal. So this belief system that they can fix it, they can get through, is part of the problem. And what we have to do is get them much more connected to their bodies and to feel their feelings, with support, of course, because on their own it would be far too overwhelming. And so that was Carl, and I'm glad to say he's certainly on the road to recovery. Don't think I've got time to go into polyvagal theory. I'm sorry. What do you think, Ian? How long have we got?
Kind of depends on how many questions we've got.
That's true. Yeah.
Are you able to maybe give us a quick run through, and then
a quick
if there's
overview
questions about it, you can expand?
Yeah, it's an important update of the seesaw kind of model of your autonomic nervous system, which looked at, on or off and sympathetic or parasympathetic. It actually rewrites the whole way of looking at it by saying it's not a seesaw, it's a hierarchical 3-stage system of social engagement, which is your upper parasympathetic system, fight and flight, which is your middle active defense system, and your freeze response, which is your unmyelinated parasympathetic system. Unmyelinated means it's slow, it doesn't work very fast. And when you go into freeze response, you often see people being quite dissociated. They've got very wide eyes, but they just look blank. And we get that with all sorts of dissociative experiences. But we also see it with children who are overwhelmed. And I sometimes see it with clients who I'm working with, who sometimes lose the track when they're talking to me, or they can't feel their bodies at certain times. And so the freeze response is really key to how people experience themselves when they're under overwhelming cumulative threat. And this model of a ladder, if you like, of this hierarchical ladder where we need to move people out of this freeze response up through sympathetic dominance and into this lovely social engagement level, which is where you can connect with people, you can meet their eye gaze, you feel safe in them, in their company, you can be creative, and so on. So polyvagal theory is the work of Stephen Porges, and I'll include a link to that with the slides. So it's just a beautiful upgrading of our understanding, and it's all based on anatomy and tracking the different nervous system paths. So stress can become chronic, it can affect everything, and it's often translated into the cells. So that's kind of the overview. You need to find safety, you need to restore the CDR, get people perceiving themselves as safe, and then the CDR gets switched off. And that is what I do. And it doesn't require a huge shift, it requires small cumulative changes. So removing the threats, changing the diet, giving them a way of soothing themselves, dealing with some of the past traumas, and maybe changing the electromagnetic nature of their body. And there's many ways to do that, which I love because they're so simple. I'm not going to go through that one because you already know a lot about nutrition. You need to restore connection both within the cell and also with the human experience. People often lose connection with their bodies, but they also lose connection with each other. and finding a way to restore that allows the autonomic nervous system to perceive more safety than threat. And then hormesis can start to carry on normally and go out of this overwhelming, unremitting stress cycle. So resolving threat and emotions is really key, and avoidance does not work. Which avoidance was where I was, it's where Carl was, it's a little bit where Ian was, I think, at times. And we need to engage with the body in order to do that. So it's not just a mental change we need to make, it's actually feeling our bodies as safe and held. And there are very many different ways you can do that, you know, from yoga, craniosacral work, tapping, havening. These are all things that I use. In particular, I use eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, which is just a fabulous tool for reprogramming past experience. But you can also sing and chant and play music and do breath work and mindfulness and meditation, whatever works for you. And it's an individual thing, but we have to learn how to tone our vagus nerve, which is a big part of the autonomics. It's your parasympathetic nerve. It's the longest nerve in the body. So restoring resilience is about actually making a restorative connection with our own bodies. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I've overrun a little, but that's all I had to say today.
Thanks, Patricia. Do you want to unshare?
Yeah.
I'm just going to quickly announce the new course. Okay, so we've been busy working away on the new course, which I'd like to just say now it starts in October. We're just starting marketing it at the moment. And this is the web page, so feel free to have a browse. Here's the link. So it's essentially a 3-module course, each in an online context. Each module takes approximately 10 weeks to go through, with weekly tutorials and check-ins. And then module 1's kind of the functional medicine stroke nutritional therapy view in a sporting model. Module 2 is classical sports nutrition with more of a quantitative focus, but still with this integrative underpinning approach. And then module 3, that's when we bring Patricia back in. So that's our specialist module, when we have specialist lecturers with certain topics that are really interesting within a sporting context. There's all the details if you want to get hold of us. So yeah, feel free to have a look and send me any questions that you would like. All right, so over to some questions. I'm going to start with Lindsay. And it's quite a deep one. Are you ready for this, Patricia?
I'll do my best.
Do you have any views about cellular imprint from past lives causing derangement?
Yes, I have seen it so many times now. And I think there is a scientific explanation, but there is also an energetic explanation. So the scientific explanation is that your epigenetics are influenced by your environment. And that's actually the changes in your genetic output is actually inheritable. So if a parent or a grandparent or a great-great-grandparent has had stress, we've actually proven it now down to 11 or 12 generations. So there is this imprint that passes along, we know, through the DNA. But I also think there's an energetic imprint. More and more I work on the energetics of the human experience. And I do know that if there's been pain and suffering in your line, your generational line, it does translate through to the cells. It absolutely does have a functional effect. We've shown it in multiple studies. So healing the intergenerational imprint is part of what I do. Past lives, I'm not so certain of in terms of my view on whether we've experienced past lives or we are energetically connected to other consciousnesses, if you like, other lives that have been, and we can imprint that. Then I'm open to that suggestion. I can't prove it, but I do know that we have to look wider than the person who is just sitting in front of us. We have to look at the experiences of that person as a totality. And if that includes some experience of past lives, then you have to take that into account.
Okay, Memi asks about a client, essentially, who has had ACE experiences like death of a twin, divorced parents, etc. She's been trying to suggest that they see a psychotherapist, but they aren't too motivated. Do you have any suggestions or any studies or reviews she can send them that can inform them of the importance of ACE without scaring them?
I think adverse childhood experience studies are very persuasive, and so I would probably refer them to the ACE. I think it's the ACE website, which I can't remember the name of, but I'll find it, because that's some of the best researched data that we have that these experiences are significant. Twin experiences, the loss of a twin has a massive effect on people. There's quite a lot of investigations into that in terms of perinatal psychology as well, and there's a book that's been written on it, and can't remember the name, but I will try and find it. But putting people into the environment where they can investigate for themselves the effect it's had on them without having to make themselves feel like they've got something wrong with them, because I think that's the problem with psychology is it often focuses on what's wrong, and people who are having physical symptoms may wonder why they're being sent to a psychotherapist, because it's not considered in mainstream medicine. If a physical problem is manifesting, then it's a physical cause, and so it is difficult to persuade people to go if it's against their kind of vision of the world. But I think the ACE studies are so compelling that that's probably where I would put people. Also the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, who is just a brilliant genius person, whose book, The Body Says No, really brought the physiology of it down to, a fine detail. He really went into detail with what happens in the body with these imprints. So there's plenty of resources that you could send your client to investigate without necessarily sending them to a psychotherapist initially.
Any more questions? I've got a simple one, Patricia, just for guidance for people. Because as you mentioned, there's so many different strategies to calm the nervous system. What about guided meditations that you maybe enjoy? That's an easy start to somebody trying to get into meditation and yoga. Right.
I actually want to say that meditation is not right for everyone. It's really important. If you are in sympathetic dominance, it's very, very hard for you to engage in meditation. If you are in a freeze state, you're dissociated anyway, so it's very hard for you to be present while you're meditating in a way. So easier ways are actually using brain entrainment, things like Brain Tap, which is an amazing app, HRV training, heart rate variability training, which uses sort of biofeedback methods. So it's a little bit more active than meditation. I certainly couldn't meditate when I was, at my worst. I couldn't even sit still. I couldn't. I literally, getting me to sit down was impossible. So I think it has to be adapted to that person and something that they are intrigued by, because getting curiosity going is really, really key, because that brings the prefrontal cortex online. So getting them intrigued by something is important. So guided meditations probably better than just sitting on your own, but I would incorporate the sound quality of binaural beats or brain entrainment, because it's just such a wonderful tool and it changes things a lot quicker. It's like meditation on steroids kind of thing.
I think that's a really, really important point, because how many people do we get saying, oh, I've tried, but I can't really meditate. I can't sit still, or my mind floats off, or same with yoga. So yeah, finding what works for you.
Yeah, for some people, it'll be more movement oriented as well, like dancing or gardening or drumming. Drumming's really brilliant, absolutely brilliant for vagal toning. So, you know, it's all the things we would have done in a tribe had we still been living in a tribe, but we all live in little boxes independent of one another, and these days we rarely go out. So and if we do, we're masked, which makes it difficult to connect with each other visually. So I think we need to find ways that enhance our sense of connection. As I said, it's one of the main things, a sense of connection with your body and a sense of connection with each other.
And with nature as well.
And with nature, perfect, yes, because nature is a living organism of its own, and it has, you know, we can get a lot from that energetically. So yes, walks in nature, touching the ground, very important, grounding. Yeah, that's certainly something I try and do. Going swimming in the sea, it's another really fantastic thing if you're able to, just to get grounded.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions, guys, before we finish off? You happy? Just sitting in the background. We've had a few thank yous and goodbyes. So thanks, Patricia.
You're welcome.
Any final words from you?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's hard to overestimate the ACE study and what it does for changing the way we feel about how the past impacts the present. And that for me was an absolute revelation. I had never realized that my past would present its bill 20 years later, but that's what happened. So that's my final word.
I'll just add to that, if I may. There's something you told me recently, and it's repaying the bank loan.
Oh, yes.
Which is a great analogy, because, yeah, many of us just overburden, overwhelm, and, yeah, essentially we've taken a loan out of our own body, and we need to repay it in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lindsay and everyone, yes, we will have a recording available tomorrow. I will send out an email with the link to the recording. We'll get Patricia's slides and any articles you want to share with me as well. Great. Thank you, and good night.